The Cold War began almost as quickly as World War II ended. In fact, there were signs that the cooperation among the Allies that had led to winning the war were already crumbling before the war ended. With the division of Korea between the United States and the USSR, you could almost see the next potential war, the Korean War. Harry S. Truman ascended to the presidency in April 1945 upon the death of Franklin Roosevelt. He served out the remainder of Roosevelt's presidential term and then ran for the presidency on his own merit in 1948. His opposition at the time was Thomas Dewey. Immediately preceding election night, Truman's popularity with the country seemed to be waning, and many thought Dewey would win. On the night of the election, returns were coming in so late that the first post-election issue of the Tribune had to go to press before complete results were known. The paper relied on its veteran Washington correspondent and political analyst, Arthur Sears Henning, to predict the winner of the election. Conventional wisdom, supported by various polls, predicted that Dewey would win the election by a landslide, so the first edition of the Tribune went to press with the headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." In this picture, Truman gets the last laugh when he wins with an electoral vote of 303 to 189. During Truman's presidency, he oversaw the beginnings of several events, including the beginning of the Cold War, the beginning of the Korean War, support for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, the creation of the United Nations, the implementation of the Truman Doctrine, and the Marshall Plan. The United States and the Soviet Union each wanted their own economic and political systems to prevail in areas their soldiers occupied at the end of World War II. This included areas not only in Germany, but also in Eastern Europe and in Asia. In Asia, communist forces on mainland China established the People's Republic of China, while nationalist forces retreated to the island of Taiwan. In Greece, civil war broke out between Anglo-American supported royalist forces and communist forces. In 1948, the Korean Peninsula was divided between a Soviet-backed government in the north and an American-backed government in the south. War broke out along the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950. On that day, North Korean troops coordinated an attack at several strategic points along the parallel and headed south toward Seoul. The United Nations Security Council voted 9-0 to adopt a resolution condemning the invasion as a breach of the peace. The Security Council did not have a Soviet delegate, since this delegate had left the Council 6 months earlier to protest the United Nations' refusal to seat a delegate from China. President Harry S. Truman quickly committed American forces to a combined United Nations military effort. 15 other nations also sent troops under the UN command. President Truman was the first world leader to officially recognize Israel as a legitimate Jewish state on May 14, 1948, only 11 minutes after its creation. His decision came after much discussion and advice from the White House staff, who had differing viewpoints. Some advisors felt that creating a Jewish state was the only proper response to the Holocaust and would benefit American interests. Others took the opposing view, concerned that the creation of a Jewish state would create more conflict in an already tumultuous region. Truman strongly supported the creation of the United Nations. He was also able to win bipartisan support for his Truman Doctrine, which established that the United States would provide political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations under threat from external or internal authoritarian forces. The Truman Doctrine effectively reoriented U.S. foreign policy away from its usual stance of withdrawal from regional conflicts not directly involving the United States to one of possible intervention in faraway conflicts. The Marshall Plan, also known as the European Recovery Program, was a U.S. program providing aid to Western Europe following the devastation of World War II. It was crafted as a 4-year plan to reconstruct cities, industries, and infrastructure heavily damaged during the war and to remove trade barriers between European neighbors, as well as foster commerce between those countries and the United States. Perhaps the greatest compliment ever paid to President Truman was when Prime Minister Winston Churchill stated in 1952 that "you, more than any other man, have saved Western civilization." Truman chose not to run for president in 1952. After the conclusion of World War II, General Dwight David Eisenhower was one of the most popular figures in the United States. He was approached by both the Democrats and the Republicans between 1945 and 1952, asking him to run for the presidency on their party platform. In 1952, he ran for the presidency and won as a member of the Republican Party. Eisenhower presided over one of the most settled decades in the country's history, although that is not to say that it did not have its problems. Militarily, the United States was the world's strongest military power. Economically, Americans achieved much prosperity as the economy grew by 37% and unemployment remained low at about 4.5%. At the end of the decade, the median American family had 30% more purchasing power than at the beginning. Inflation was minimal, in part because of Eisenhower's efforts to balance the budget. The fruits of this prosperity, new cars, suburban houses, and other consumer goods, were available to more people than ever. Socially and culturally, American society sought uniformity. Conformity was common, as young and old alike followed group norms rather than striking out on their own. Though men and women had been forced into new employment patterns during World War II, once the war was over, traditional roles were reaffirmed. However, the 1950s were also an era of great conflict. For example, the growing civil rights movement and the crusade against communism at home and abroad in the Korean War exposed underlying divisions in American society. Notable events occurring during the Eisenhower administration included domestic events such as 1. The passage of the Interstate Highway System in 1956, and 2. The decision in the landmark Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. In regard to foreign affairs, Eisenhower is credited with ending the Korean conflict, isolating the Soviet Union, and exploring the option of supporting French colonial forces in Vietnam. Prior to the Eisenhower administration, health problems suffered by the presidents were not regularly admitted to the public. However, Eisenhower was probably the first president to allow his personal health problems to become public while in office. Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969, of congestive heart failure in Washington, D.C. at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. He was buried at his presidential library in Abilene, Kansas. John F. Kennedy was the youngest man elected President of the United States. He was also the first president born in the 20th century. President Kennedy served in the Navy during World War II as a PT, Patrol Torpedo Boat Commander. On August 1, 1943, the PT boat of which he was commander, PT-109, was struck by a Japanese destroyer named the Amagiri. Kennedy and most of his men aboard the boat survived the impact and were able to swim to a nearby island. They were rescued on August 8th. Candidate John F. Kennedy selected Lyndon B. Johnson as his running mate in the 1960 presidential election. Johnson had been a Democratic candidate for the office, but Kennedy was selected as the standard-bearer of the party during the Democratic convention. While Kennedy respected Johnson for his experience in the Senate, the two men never really liked each other. For Kennedy, though, it was essential that he include Johnson as his running mate in order to get the vote of the Solid South Democratic voters. It would be the only way that he could win the election. John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon participated in the first nationally televised presidential debate. The debate was also heard over the radio. To those who watched the debate on television, they believed Kennedy won the debate, while those who listened to the debate on radio believed Nixon won. Why the difference, you might ask? The answer is visual cues. On the television, Nixon looked shifty and appeared to be dishonest. There were several reasons for this. One, he was recovering from having spent 3 weeks in the hospital for an inflamed knee, so he looked pale and gaunt, while Kennedy looked tanned and rested. 2, because he was standing up during the debate, the knee bothered him so much that he kept shifting from leg to leg throughout the debate. 3, he picked the wrong colored suit. He wore a light colored suit, so he blended into the background, where Kennedy wore a dark colored suit and stood out against the background. Radio listeners did not have these visual cues to use to determine the winner. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister who preached nonviolence and civil disobedience in an attempt to gain equality for African Americans. He was born Michael King Jr., but his father had both their names changed after a trip to Germany, where he was inspired by the Protestant Reformation leader Martin Luther. King was a prolific writer and speechmaker. His I Have a Dream speech, given at the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963, is one of his most well-known speeches. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom brought together the nation's most prominent civil rights leaders, along with tens of thousands of marchers, to press the United States government for equality. The Kennedy administration's foreign policy was dominated by American-Soviet relations. The Bay of Pigs occurred in April 1961. The plan was developed during the Eisenhower administration and was intended to train Cuban exiles for an invasion of their homeland. The plan anticipated that the Cuban people and elements of the Cuban military would support the invasion. The ultimate goal was the overthrow of Castro and the establishment of a non-communist government friendly to the United States. The invasion was a disaster and had a lasting impact on the administration. In order to make up for the failed invasion, the Kennedy administration implemented Operation Mongoose, a plan to sabotage and destabilize the Cuban government and economy, which included the possibility of assassinating Fidel Castro, the communist-supported Cuban leader. The Cuban Missile Crisis began in October 1962 when an American U-2 spy plane secretly photographed nuclear missile sites being built by the Soviet Union on the island of Cuba. Kennedy decided to place a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent the Soviets from bringing in more military supplies. He demanded the removal of the missiles already there and the destruction of the sites. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev responded to Kennedy's message with a statement that the U.S. blockade was an act of aggression and that Soviet ships bound for Cuba would be ordered to proceed. However, some ships turned back from the quarantine line, while others were stopped by U.S. naval forces, but they contained no offensive weapons and so were allowed to proceed. On October 26th, Premier Khrushchev sent a message to the White House proposing a resolution that would involve the removal of the missiles from Cuba if the United States promised not to invade the island. A second message from Khrushchev proposed an additional deal of U.S. removal of Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The U.S. was already planning to remove these missiles, so there was no reason to not agree with this requirement, although this would be kept secret for more than 25 years. For the Kennedy administration, this was a success. Vietnam. While the Kennedy administration increased the number of American military advisors to more than 16,000, he also pressed the South Vietnamese government of Nguyen Dinh Diem to institute long overdue political and economic reforms. The situation in Vietnam did not improve. Kennedy declared that while the war in Vietnam was the Vietnamese People's War, the U.S. had to participate in the defense of Asia from communism. Domestically, the Kennedy administration implemented numerous social programs as well as the race to the moon. Although the Democratic Party held a majority in Congress during Kennedy's administration, he was unable to get most of his progressive legislative reforms passed. Many Southerners in his own party, several of whom chaired Congress's most powerful committees, were suspicious of Kennedy, his Northeast establishment background, and his domestic policies. On November 22, 1963, while in Dallas, Texas on a campaign stop, President Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. After Mr. Kennedy was pronounced dead at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, his body was loaded onto Air Force One. However, before the plane could depart Texas, Lyndon B. Johnson, Mr. Kennedy's vice president, was sworn in as the new 36th President of the United States. This is a picture of the swearing-in ceremony of Lyndon B. Johnson on Air Force One. Lyndon Baines Johnson was a master politician. He served in Congress for 24 years, spending 6 of those years as Majority Leader of the Senate, a position of power within Congress. The Majority Leader serves as the party's spokesperson. Working with committee chairs and ranking members of the Congress, the Majority Leader schedules business on the floor by calling bills from the calendar. They open and close the day's proceedings, keep legislation moving, and protect the rights and interests of party members. After graduating from high school in 1924, Johnson spent some time in California, but moved back to Texas and enrolled at Southwest Texas State Teachers College in 1926. Upon his graduation from college, he became a high school teacher in debate and public speaking. He also developed an interest in politics. During the 1930s, Johnson served as a legislative secretary to U.S. Representative Richard M. Kleberg. Kleberg had little interest in the day-to-day duties of a congressman, instead delegating them to Johnson. After Franklin Roosevelt became president in 1932, Johnson became a lifelong supporter of Roosevelt's New Deal. Johnson was elected Speaker of the Little Congress, a group of congressional aides where he cultivated congressmen, newspapermen, and lobbyists. Johnson's friends soon included aides to President Roosevelt, as well as fellow Texans such as Vice President John Nance Garner and Congressman Sam Rayburn. In 1935, Johnson was appointed head of the Texas National Youth Administration, which enabled him to create government-funded education and job opportunities for young people. He resigned 2 years later to run for Congress. He was described by friends, fellow politicians, and historians as motivated by lust for power and control. In June 1963, President Kennedy, in a nationally televised speech, urged the nation to enact legislation toward guaranteeing equal treatment of every American regardless of race. Soon after, Kennedy proposed that Congress consider civil rights legislation that would address voting rights, public accommodations, school desegregation, non-discrimination in federally assisted programs, and more. With Kennedy's assassination, Johnson used his many political skills to force the passage of the proposed legislation through Congress, which culminated in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The act outlawed segregation in businesses such as theaters, restaurants, and hotels. It banned discriminatory practices in employment and ended segregation in public places such as swimming pools, libraries, and public schools. Title VII of the Act created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, to implement the law. Johnson's administration was defined by the Vietnam War. By 1968, 500,000 U.S. troops were fighting in Vietnam. Rioting against the war was rampant. While his foreign policy in Vietnam was the contributing factor to his decision not to run for a second term, Mr. Johnson's domestic policies were very successful. The Great Society program was Johnson's agenda for Congress in January 1965. Aid to education, attack on disease, Medicare, urban renewal, beautification, conservation, development of depressed regions, a wide-scale fight against poverty, control and prevention of crime and delinquency, removal of obstacles to the right to vote. During his administration, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Revenue Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. After leaving the presidency in January 1969, President Johnson left the public view. He returned to Johnson City, Texas, and began work on his autobiography. In 1973, while in bed on the telephone, Johnson died of a heart attack. The day before his death, President Nixon ended America's involvement in the Vietnam War.